Weighted addition versus multiplication to fundamental mathematical architectures for biomedical risk modeling Part 1, number 1703, VPT 142, June 30, 2026. Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation. Category: Research Methodology. Preface for readers: eat more protein and fresh vegetables. Eat less red meat and processed food. Reduce food portions if overweight. Eating a little less will not hurt you. Overeating for yours will. Exercise every day. Walk at least 7,000 to 8,000 steps daily. Drink 85 to 100 ounces to 0.5 to 3.0 liters of water each day. Sleep 6 to 7 hours every night. Manage stress. Avoid emotionally draining people and unnecessary conflicts. Put your health first. Wealth, fame, and power mean little without health and life. Introduction. During the development of my biomedical mathematical models, I gradually realized that two fundamentally different mathematic architectures exist. This realization did not arise from abstract mathematics alone, but from nearly 2 decades of analyzing my own longitudinal biomedical data and comparing different mathematical formulations against real physiological discoveries and events. For approximately the first 9 years of my research from 2017 through 2025, I developed and refined a metabolic model based on a weighted additive architecture. The model incorporated multiple physiological and lifestyle variables, including body weight, glucose, blood pressure, blood lipids, food intake, exercise, sleep, stress, daily regularity, and hydration. Each variable was assigned a weighting coefficient according to its relative contribution to overall metabolic health and to estimating the long-term risks of major mortality-related diseases, including cardiovascular disease (CVD), chronic kidney disease (CKD), and stroke. Mathematically, the model can be expressed as overall metabolic score equals weighted contribution of factor 1 plus weighted contribution of factor 2 plus. Although each variable is multiplied by a weighting coefficient, the fundamental mathematical structure remains additive. The weighting coefficients simply adjust the relative importance of each variable. They do not change the underlying mathematical architecture. Therefore, a weighted additive model remains an additive model. This type of model is well suited for describing the overall state of a biomedical system because it assumes that each physiological factor contributes independently to the final outcome. Using this approach, I successfully developed metabolic indexes that described long-term metabolic health and estimated the risks of cardiovascular disease (CVD) and chronic kidney disease (CKD). However, after my hemorrhagic stroke on June 21, 2025, I began asking a different scientific question. Instead of asking how much each physiological factor contributes independently, I asked how multiple physiological factors interact simultaneously to produce a catastrophic biological event, such as a stroke. This seemingly simple change in perspective eventually led to the development of the Triggering Sensitivity Index (TSI) framework. Rather than using addition, the TSI model uses multiplication to represent the interaction among selected physiological variables, such as systolic blood pressure, pulse pressure, glucose, body weight, and other relevant physiological factors, from an engineering perspective. These two mathematical operations represent fundamentally different physical concepts. Addition represents accumulation without interaction or amplification. Each physiological variable contributes independently to the overall system response, while multiplication represents interaction and amplification, when multiple physiological variables simultaneously move away from their normal ranges. Their combined influence grows disproportionately larger than the simple sum of their individual contributions. The interaction itself becomes an important part of the biomedical mechanism. This distinction is not merely mathematical. It reflects two fundamentally different ways of describing biomedical systems. Case study: weighted addition versus multiplication. The importance of this distinction became apparent when I compared the two mathematical architectures using exactly the same 15-year longitudinal biomedical dataset, because both models were derived from essentially the same physiological variables. The primary difference between them was not the data itself, but the mathematical architecture used to combine the variables. The weighted additive metabolic indexes successfully characterized long-term metabolic trends and estimated the risks of cardiovascular disease (CVD) and chronic kidney disease (CKD) separately, by assigning weighting coefficients to individual physiological variables. The additive architecture summarized their independent contributions into an overall estimate of metabolic status. The multiplicative trajectory stress index TSI, however, revealed a different mathematical behavior. Instead of averaging independent contributions, multiplication preserved the interactions among physiological variables and naturally amplified their combined effects. Consequently, the TSI model emphasized physiological interaction rather than simple accumulation. The distinction became even more apparent when the results were analyzed using the viscoplastic medicine theory (VMT) and viscoplastic and topological theory (VPT) frameworks. Although the weighted additive mean models and the multiplicative TSI model exhibited similar long-term trends because they were derived from the same physiological dataset, their dynamic behaviors differed considerably when examined from mechanical and topological perspectives. The annual trend plot demonstrated that all three indexes gradually declined over the 15-year observation period, indicating continuous improvement in overall metabolic health. However, the multiplicative TSI consistently remained more sensitive to the combined interactions among physiological variables than either of the weighted additive models. Interpretation of the VMT energy contribution percent. The VMT energy analysis showed that the combined TSI cardiorenal model received approximately 51% of its cumulative energy contribution from the CKD component and 49% from the CVD component. Although the difference is relatively small, it reflects the chronological evolution of my personal disease history rather than an inherent difference between the heart and kidneys. My major cardiovascular problems occurred primarily between 1994 and 2004. Following comprehensive lifestyle modifications beginning in 2010, my cardiovascular risk gradually declined and remained well controlled for more than a decade. By contrast, chronic kidney disease developed later in 2010 and therefore contributed a greater proportion of the physiological loading during the 15-year observation period. From the VMT perspective, the slightly higher kidney contribution reflects the more recent and persistent physiological burden associated with CKD. The heart had already undergone substantial recovery and stabilization, whereas the kidneys continued to experience a relatively greater cumulative loading. Consequently, within the combined cardiorenal TSI model, the cumulative VMT energy was distributed approximately 51% to CKD and 49% to CVD, consistent with the chronological progression of my individual biomedical history. Topological data analysis results for each dimensional scatterplot further demonstrated that the TSI cardiorenal, CVD-ME, and CKD-ME indexes evolved along a continuous trajectory rather than as randomly distributed. Observations: the representative years 2012, 2016, 2020, 2023, and 2026 formed an orderly path through three-dimensional space, illustrating the continuous evolution of the physiological system under two different mathematical architectures. The two-dimensional radar plots provided another complementary geometric interpretation. Instead of comparing individual numerical values alone, they illustrated how the relative geometric relationships among the three indexes gradually changed over time. The continuously contracting radar profiles reflected the progressive improvement of the physiological system while simultaneously revealing subtle differences between the weighted additive and multiplicative mathematical architectures. Within the triangular polygon, the TSI axis exhibited a much greater contraction than either the CVD-ME or CKD-ME axes. This geometric feature visually demonstrates the amplification effect of the multiplicative architecture. Because the TSI model preserves the interactions among physiological variables, improvements occurring simultaneously across multiple physiological factors produce a proportionally larger reduction in the TSI than in the weighted additive CVD-ME and CKD-ME models. In contrast, the weighted additive models primarily reflect the accumulation of independent contributions, resulting in relatively smaller geometric changes. The wider contraction of the TSI axis therefore provides visual evidence that multiplication captures physiological interaction and amplification more effectively than weighted addition. The VMT analysis provided an additional engineering interpretation, rather than viewing disease progression as the simple accumulation of independent variables. VMT treats the physiological system as undergoing continuous mechanical deformation under long-term physiological loading. The calculated strain, stress, height, enclosed area, and cumulative VMT energy together describe the evolution of the system from a viscoplastic perspective. The cumulative VMT energy curve demonstrated that physiological loading accumulated progressively throughout the 15-year period, rather than increasing linearly. The cumulative energy reflected the continuous interaction among physiological variables and their long-term influence on the biological system. By the end of the observation period, the cumulative energy reached 100%, providing a quantitative description of the complete physiological evolution represented by the dataset. The VPT analysis further demonstrated that multiplication preserved the topological continuity of the physiological trajectory, the connected three-dimensional pathway, together with the two-dimensional radar geometry, illustrated that the biological system evolved continuously rather than through isolated or random changes. These geometric characteristics became more apparent in the multiplicative architecture because interaction among variables remained explicitly represented throughout the mathematical formulation. The comparison therefore revealed an important engineering distinction between the two mathematical architectures. The weighted additive architecture effectively summarizes the independent contributions of multiple physiological variables and provides an excellent estimate of overall metabolic status and chronic disease risk. The multiplicative architecture, on the other hand, preserves physiological interaction and amplification through multiplication. Rather than simply averaging multiple variables, it captures how they influence one another simultaneously, thereby revealing dynamic characteristics that are largely hidden within an additive formulation. The VMT and VPT analyses provide complementary mechanical and topological interpretations of these differences. Together, they demonstrate that weighted addition and multiplication are not competing mathematical methods, but two fundamentally different mathematical architectures designed to describe different aspects of the same biomedical system. Looking back, I now believe that the most important insight was not discovering a new mathematical operation. Multiplication has existed for thousands of years, just as Newton did not invent multiplication when he formulated F equals m times a. Scientific progress comes from recognizing which mathematical architecture most faithfully represents the underlying mechanism of the natural phenomenon being studied. The equations themselves already existed. My contribution has been to recognize that, within my own 17-year longitudinal biomedical dataset building and observing, selecting the appropriate mathematical architecture is as important as selecting the physiological variables themselves. The weighted additive and multiplicative models reveal different but complementary aspects of the same biomedical system. Together, they provide a more comprehensive understanding of physiological behavior than either mathematical architecture alone. This is part 1.